So the Indian Army is a very strange army. In the midst of World War II, which is the great contest of nations and ideology, the Indian Army is a colonial army. It's a multiracial army. It's officered by the people who colonized India. The Indians are fighting the Germans and the Japanese for the British, and at the same time the Indian Army is putting down an anti-colonial uprising in India, and moreover, the British allow 3 to 5 million Indians to die in a man-made famine in Bengal during the war that Indian soldiers were very concerned about. And despite all of this, the army fights, and it fights reasonably effective. So it's an interesting army to think about how the army may not be what we think armies are, that they don't necessarily fight out of nationalist reasons, unlike the other national armies of World War II that are motivated to defend their homelands or for ideologies that their governments were pursuing. The Indian Army had none of these supports, yet still it fights. Well, I'm in the very strange position of being one of the few scholars on the left who have a real knowledge and empathy with the military, both the contemporary military and historically. And I wanted to be the person that would write the book. The people who normally study the military, who are very suspicious of the military, who mostly are against it politically, I wanted to be the person that would give them an account of what the military was as a social institution, because I think we've misrecognized what the Army is in social and political theory. I'm one of the last people to have gone around and interviewed British officers who were company commanders in the Indian Army in World War II. So in the late 90s and the early 2000s, I went all over Britain and did about 35 interviews with people who served as company commanders, as company officers who officered Indian troops in World War II. Many of them, of course, Tories or right-wing politically, but having served with South Asian soldiers, with Muslim soldiers, were in a very interesting political position in Britain at the time. In addition to that, because the British were so concerned that the Indian Army would revolt or mutiny during the war, they were very worried because the Japanese raised an Indian Army from prisoners of war. They closely censored, read the mail of Indian soldiers, and they produced very elaborate reports, kindly translated for people, of what Indian soldiers all around the globe, fighting anywhere in World War II, what they were writing home about. As a kind of insight into the mindset of a colonial soldier, these were invaluable resources. In addition to that, there's a very rich memoir literature of Indian officers who later became senior officers of the independent Indian Army, of the British officers. They wrote memoirs, and there were many kind of typescript memoirs, battalion histories that were never published, but were available in the archives. So I used a whole range of sources, from official papers to interviews to censored letters and memoirs, as well as the sort of standard archival resources at the India Office and the National Archives in Britain. So I think the most surprising thing that I discovered is that it's part of the great mythology of the Indian Army that the officers knew their troops, that they understood the language, that they learned the culture, that they circulated in the villages from whom where their soldiers were from. And what I found out is that even the long service regular British Indian officers who joined the Army as a career sometime in the interwar period, they didn't know languages very well, and they would regularly accuse each other of not knowing the languages in the pages of their service journal. And when the Army expanded for World War II, and all of these young middle-class Brits came over to be officers of the Indian Army, they would write memoirs like Pseudo Sahib and Emergency Sahib and so on. They, of course, had no time to learn Urdu, much less the vernacular language of their men. So this modern army, made up of illiterate peasants who are fighting in a modern, complicated war, no one is speaking in their first language, and the officers are often giving orders by gesticulation. Yet the army still worked. As I said, it's a very strange army. So I think one of the principal ways in which the Army has been misunderstood as an institution is it's seen as a modern and Western institution that was developed in early modern Europe and then diffused to the rest of the world. So it's associated with modernity, the West, and the Greco-Roman heritage of the West. In fact, what I argue is the Army is not modern, it's not Western, it's a package of ritual institutions. It operates on blood debt, blood sacrifice. This is not, what we think it is. Even if it's a high-tech army, what its core sort of social institution is a ritual.